Welcome to the Roetzel HealthLaw HotSpot. HealthLaw HotSpot is a podcast for physicians and health professionals that covers the legal issues and trends that affect the healthcare industry.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the HealthLaw HotSpot. I'm Ericka Adler, shareholder and leader of the HealthLaw practice at Roetzel Andres. And today I'm joined by Karen Adinolfi, one of the shareholders at Roetzel Andres and part of our employment services group. Today, we're going to be taking on the topic of the Illinois vaccine executive order that came out from Governor Pritzker, which has created quite a lot of questions and issues in Illinois, especially among licensed healthcare workers and among their practices, including physician practices, dentist practices, and other types of professionals that are interacting with patients. So a couple weeks ago, Karen and I did just generally the vaccine mandate overall and whether employers could enforce it. This is a little more specific because now Illinois has come out with an executive order. So why don't we start with having Karen describe this executive order so we understand what it actually says.
Sure. The executive order came out on August 26, 2021. It applies to multiple categories of employees. But probably the most prominent one, and the one that's probably caused the most controversy, at least amongst our clients, is that directed at healthcare workers. The definition of a healthcare worker in the order is very broad. If you are employed by an entity that provides healthcare services, which is pretty much any doctor's office, dental office, emergency center, hospice, those kinds of facilities, and you are in close contact with people, which is 6 feet, more than 15 minutes a week, then you have to either be vaccinated in full, or if you can't, because of a couple exemptions we'll talk about, then you have to submit weekly negative tests and wear a mask. So we haven't seen a lot of sort of practical commentary about how this is going to go. And so we've been fielding lots of questions about employees who are balking at this requirement for whatever reason. The two exemptions that the order specifically states that would allow a person to forego the vaccine in lieu, and take on weekly testing and mask wearing are a medical condition that would be that is contraindicated by the vaccine, or a sincerely held religious belief that would prevent a person from getting the vaccine. They're not, again, employees who have one or both of those exemptions aren't off scot-free. They still will have to undergo the weekly negative testing and the mask wearing.
Right. And a couple of additional points. One is that it appears to be required to also do the masking no matter what, right? So everybody in the office, even if vaccinated. And then the testing, if you are going to go out and get vaccinated between the times that you have the vaccine shots, you still have to provide that testing. So one of the things about testing to note also that it appears to be at the employee's expense, because it says the employee has to present the test on not less than a weekly basis. So it seems to be the employee's expense, although I know I've spoken with some employers that are, just keeping tests in their office or making them available. So that's one thing I just wanted to point out. I think, between the get the vaccine or be in violation of this mandate and get the free vaccine or pay for testing, there's a push here for people to kind of make a decision here. Do I want my job and do I want to not spend money on this? So I get where the governor's coming from and trying to push this, but obviously there is a lot of objection, whether people believe in the vaccine or not, or just some people believe in the vaccine but don't like the idea of having this forced on anyone who works for them, etc. So, so some of the questions that we've been getting, and I want to kind of to run through them. First of all, there was a very short period of time here to get that first shot. I think the governor gave everybody a week, and due to work and other obligations, it may not be quite possible to do it in the time frame that the governor has placed. What are your thoughts on people who make an appointment but either can't get the shot on the exact time frame described by the governor, or even you and I talked about it, that they may have a true medical issue and want to get a doctor's appointment and just can't get it, in the next week? So can you just speak to that timing issue?
Sure. The governor's order is actually very clear about the dates, but as you said, there was not a lot of time for initial compliance if you haven't been vaccinated already. Order came out on August 26th. The deadline for getting the first shot of a 2-shot dose or the only shot of a 1-shot dose is September 5th, which is this Sunday, I believe. So, again, not a lot of time with the the holiday coming up. It's I think made it even sort of more difficult for people. So I think that people who show a good faith effort, like I tried to make an appointment to get the vaccine and all I could get was something on September 10th, or I have an appointment with my doctor scheduled for September 15th. I think, employers can be flexible about that. I don't necessarily see an issue at this early stage with allowing that flexibility, so long as employees who, again, are doing the testing on a weekly basis. So if someone can't get their vaccine until the 10th, next week they will have to present a weekly test that shows that they are negative. And same with the person who can't get an appointment until September 15th. Once we start talking about after 30 days, I can't get an appointment to November, December, I think that's going to be more problematic. So I think you can be flexible to a point, but once we start getting, sort of 14 days, 21 days later, I think that's going to be a harder sell to the extent this order is ever enforced, which we have not seen any kind of commentary about how or if or how that would happen.
Right.
So yeah, I think, especially with respect to the medical exemptions, if someone has a genuine concern that the vaccine might otherwise impair them or worsen a condition, they should see their doctor. And it's, it may be something they can do via telemedicine or something like that. But, we would encourage employers to at least be flexible in these early days.
All right. So I guess another question or issue I want to point out is that there seems to be a lot of confusion about whether you can just do testing in lieu of getting vaccinated. And I think this confusion came because the governor made some offhand remarks and there was a press release that was kind of poorly worded, and the executive order is, could have been better written itself. So I'm getting a lot of calls where people are like, oh no, this says you can be, tested instead of vaccinated. And I know you and I have discussed this, and the exact wording of, I don't want to call it the law, but the executive order is where we get our information and what we rely on. And that does not appear in the wording of the executive order.
Yeah, it's certainly not from the language of the order an either or proposition. It is a mandatory vaccination order, and the provisions in there about if you're not fully vaccinated, you must be tested, I think apply to the times, that interim time between your first dose and your second dose, and then the 2-week period after your final dose, which you're not considered under the language of the order to be fully vaccinated. And so during those weeks, you would have to be tested. I understand where the confusion is coming from, as I think you do, that, again, it's not really, very clearly worded in some places. But again, this order to me is not giving a choice. It is providing for an alternative for those who are in process of becoming fully vaccinated or because of a medical or religious reason cannot be vaccinated. It's not for someone just to choose, I'll do testing instead of getting the vaccine.
All right, so let's talk about this religious exemption. So I've had any number of phone calls over the past couple of days with people letting us know how religious their employees have suddenly become. People are, finding on the internet all kinds of forms and religious exemptions. And so and I know we covered this in our last podcast as well, but let's talk about just generally under the law, when you're required to do something and you want to get a religious exemption, what that standard is.
Sure. Under Title VII, which is the federal anti-discrimination law that addresses religion, as well as I would say probably every state law in the United States, someone with what's called a sincerely held religious belief can seek a reasonable accommodation to sort of exempt them from some policy or procedure of their employer. We see this, typically we have seen this in a couple different categories. One is like clothing and dress codes. If you have, no hats in the workplace, you still have to let, a Sikh turban or something like that. We also see it with attendance issues. I can't work on Fridays or Saturdays because of the Sabbath, or I'm a Seventh-day Adventist, or whatever the reason is. And so there's a lot of case law about that. We haven't seen too much with vaccines until now, simply because there is rarely a mandate on those. But the EEOC has taken the position that, yes, an employer can require vaccines. I think here it would cover the governor's order as well, so long as if you have an employee with a sincerely held religious belief that would prevent them from getting the vaccine, you have to make a reasonable accommodation for that. So, for instance, a lot of the proffered reasons we're seeing are with respect to stem cells, that there is information out there that in the development of the vaccines, there has been the use of stem cells, which for those employees who are pro-life can be problematic. No one said where the origin of these particular stem cells, but that is not an uncommon belief. So if someone has a sincerely held religious belief as to pro-life issues, they will say, I don't believe I can take the vaccine without violating those religious beliefs. So they can be required to make that request in writing, that they be exempted from the governor's order with respect to the mandatory vaccinations. And the employer has the obligation to say, okay, what accommodation can we make? And here the governor's order actually sets forth an accommodation, which is the weekly negative testing and the mask wearing. So, if you have someone with an objection to the vaccine and you don't have any reason to dispute it, then you can say, all right, but you still have to, you will have to comply with this weekly negative testing requirement. Again, if you have some evidence that this is not a sincerely held religious belief, for instance, maybe a couple months ago, this particular employee went to a pro-choice march or has made Facebook postings, for instance, about the Texas law, saying it's terrible, it violates the law, abortion should be legal, then you have a sort of a reason to question that. Like, is this truly a sincerely held religious belief, or do you just not want to be vaccinated? We've also seen a couple of issues with people who say, not only can I not get the vaccine without violating my religious beliefs, I should not have to be tested because that would also violate my religious beliefs. I have a feeling that that is one of the things being sort of proffered on the internet, because we're seeing a lot of very similar language in those requests. And those things typically have been attributed to one line in the book of Matthew, which is not about medical care at all. So, again, you have to engage with them to see if there's some accommodation you can make. If you have, say, a clerical employee, maybe you can let them work at home. But if they're patient facing, or it's not a work at home type of job, you may be in the position of saying, well, we can't accommodate this. You have to be excluded from the office. We'll put you on an unpaid leave of absence. We'll, and if this order's lifted or changed or challenged, then we'll bring you back. But I don't think that allowing somebody to not be tested would be a reasonable accommodation, especially in the healthcare setting and in a patient-facing role.
Right. Now, I think, a lot of people out there, a lot of employers, even if they are, very supportive of the vaccine, are willing to, be a little loose in terms of accepting these religious exemptions as it relates to not getting the vaccine. But I think it does, create some risk for other workers in the workplace as well as patients.
Sure.
To not require that testing to be done. And I've yet to see a really good argument as to why the testing, what religious exemption there could be for the testing.
Yeah.
And I know you and I talked about this. I guess the argument would be if you do preventative care otherwise, then how is spitting on a sample or swabbing a thing in your nose really going to affect your religious belief? So I guess we have to look at this as a case-by-case basis, but I have yet to see, any compelling arguments about that. All right, so another interesting issue that we have had to deal with over the past few days is this Illinois statute that has to do with the right of healthcare workers to exercise their conscience. And so I wanted to have you kind of speak to that, because I think it's being sold somewhere by someone. And, when you get multiple people in an office and multiple, people in a community all sending us the same exemption, I think it's important that we understand what it says and we talk about it. Now, I have two questions. One is is filling out a form for for a religious exemption and just stapling a copy of this enough, first of all, and then second of all, is bringing up this statute even compelling at all? So those are kind of the questions that we have.
Yep. Certainly when an employee is making a request for an exemption, is seeking an accommodation, they don't really have to provide you anything more than their description of the sincerely held religious belief. They don't have to provide photocopies of passages from the Bible. They don't have to provide any letters from their pastor or anything like that. If something is very unusual, someday when you all have time, I'll tell you about my thou shalt not direct deposit case. If it seems unusual, then yes, the employer can say, well, I'm not sure where this is coming from, but again, the employer can't require a certain level of proof. So, but to the extent that someone just says, I don't believe I should have to get the vaccine and staples the conscience statute to it, I don't believe that would be enough. I think that they would still have to show what the basis for that conscience, that belief is. So, again, we've seen kind of descriptions of the alleged sincerely held religious belief with this attached. And I think that's probably sufficient because they have described it. I don't know that the Illinois healthcare conscience statute is going to carry the day. There's very little out there about it, certainly nothing in the context of this governor's order or the vaccine even generally. The statute's meant to protect healthcare providers of healthcare who refuse to perform a procedure or provide a certain service that they sincerely believe violates their conscience or some religious belief. It's typically applied in cases of a pharmacist who refuses to dispense the Plan B medication, or a doctor who refuses to perform an abortion. That those individuals are protected from things like discipline from the medical board, revocation of privileges, anything like that. I don't see where there's some troubling language in it, which I think is, again, attributable to some sloppy drafting, that seems to indicate that someone can refuse medical care because of their conscience or a religious belief. But if you look at the context of that language, it's really, again, in the provision of healthcare to others. That you are protected from that discipline, should you refuse to do so. Again, if it was supposed to be just a general right of conscience as to your own health care, there would be no need to limit it to just healthcare workers. That it would be every employee in the state of Illinois would have that ability. And that's just not the case under the statute. So again, we don't know what the courts would do with this if, and I think it's probably more a question of when they're faced with it. And it may be that they say that the statute does apply and it trumps everything else. We'll have to wait and see. And I think, it's unfortunate that it causes that kind of uncertainty when I think employers here, healthcare employers, are just trying to do the right thing, both in terms of complying with the order and ensuring the safety and health of their patients and other workers. So it's a little bit of a kind of a wrench in the machine, I suppose. But, I think you have to, follow the governor's order, and see what you can do. And if it turns out you can't accommodate someone who doesn't want to be tested, then that sort of has to be so be it, I think, at this point.
Right. So what would be the liability then for a practice that does exactly that? They follow the governor's order, they accept a religious exemption perhaps for the vaccine, but require testing, and the person refuses it, and they terminate, and that person was, again, trying to use that statute. And then later on, the court finds that, in fact, that statute does trump the executive order. Is there liability for the employer at that point for having terminated an employee, for example?
There is under the conscience statute. It does provide for a private cause of action by a former employee or someone who has seen them been demoted or transferred and suffered some financial harm. It does provide for what's called pain and suffering. And it's sort of a treble damages, which means you can get threefold the actual damages. And there's also, it's a minimum of $2,500 for each violation, which doesn't seem like a lot, but I sense that it's always going to be typically more than that. I think that, again, a way to perhaps mitigate it, although the financial harm won't be mitigated, is again to think about this unpaid leave of absence. We're not terminating you. And if we can bring you back, without a test, we will do that. That can be a hard sell, both for employees who won't be getting paid and probably would lose health insurance, to employers who are like, well, do I replace them while this is going on? It's not an easy situation. So I think there is risk there. I don't want to overstate the risk. But again, I don't want to underestimate it either. So it's just something I think employers need to be aware of, and take the position that statute doesn't apply in this type of situation. I would note the governor's order mentions nothing about it.
Right. I would be really surprised if a court decided to impose that, knowing about the confusion of, what is going on here, the fact that healthcare workers were trying to, comply with an emergency executive order from the governor. I mean, I'd be really surprised if that was the
I
outcome.
would too. And I think almost the best thing that could happen is for someone to perhaps challenge the governor's order in court. So we might get at least some clarity about some of the language, perhaps the interaction with the statute. But I haven't seen anything about that so far. And there has, again, usually you see, law firms coming out with commentary and whatnot, and I just have not seen anything really about this. So
right, I think
I'm not sure if that means anything, but at the same time, it's not letting us, give a lot of, non sort of vague advice to our clients.
Right. We've seen a high volume. I've had, 20, 30 calls about this just this week from different types of providers. But I think it's just because of the high volume of providers that we represent. I'm sure hospital counsel is super busy on the hospital side.
Oh gosh, yeah.
Issues as well. So we probably are just a little bit disproportionate in the number of offices that are calling us. But these are certainly really challenging issues, and we definitely have to do the right thing. And I guess one more question is, what about, federal? So a lot of people before this even came out had a mandate in their office to be vaccinated. Does this change that in any way? Can they just take the position regardless of whatever the state of Illinois is saying? I want a mandate no matter what, and I'm not. I see them as being kind of equivalent. You can follow both at the same time, but I didn't know if there was any kind of differences in what the state is requiring versus what people might have done on their own beforehand.
Well, certainly if any employer really who had a mandatory vaccination policy prior to this order, this order doesn't affect it, except that the order is actually a little more beneficial to employees in that type of situation, because it does allow the testing as the alternative if there's a sincerely held religious belief. Even if you had a mandate without this order, you still would have to accommodate people. But your accommodation might be, we just can't have you here anymore, that we don't think testing is enough. The fact that the governor's order does allow testing as that alternative or as that accommodation, it might give employers some more flexibility than just having to automatically exit an employee who needs to be vaccinated. And certainly, and I think this applies to everyone, if the objection to the vaccination is just, I don't think the governor's order is valid, this is too much government, et cetera, that's not any kind of valid objection. They can say that on their Facebook page all they want, but that doesn't get you an accommodation, which is why I think we're seeing these websites popping up, like, if you don't want to get the vaccination, here's what you can say. And so, again, if there's ever litigation, that's when those things will be, we'll see how well they stick, if it's ever challenged.
I have one other question, which is these fake vaccination cards that people are buying. And I had one employer ask me yesterday, what is their liability if they're presented with a card that they believe, or maybe even they know is not valid? And I think that's a great question. Are they, going to get in trouble if somebody ever says, why did you accept this when you knew it wasn't real? Can you speak to that? I'm putting you on the spot a little bit.
Oh, no. And I think, we see this a lot too with, falsified employment applications, that kind of thing. And if something happens, then the question is, well, shouldn't you have known that this was somehow falsified or whatever? To the extent it's obvious, I think there was a story in the media about someone trying to fly with a fake one and they spelled Moderna wrong, which is what got the attention of,
Right.
If it's obvious, it's a photocopy, ask for the original card. There's things you can do if to your eye, it seems fake. The dates are off. It doesn't look like, I think the template's widely available. You can, check and make sure it's all there. But you're not expected to be a document examiner. If, again, if this appears to be valid to you, it's a card, it looks like all the other ones. There's nothing misspelled. It looks authentic. Then I think you're in the position of having to accept that. If it turns out that it's falsified, you would take action presumably at that point. But I don't know that anyone would be able to say, unless in the absence of an obvious flaw or forgery, that you should have known. But I think it's a point taken that you do take some time to examine. You do satisfy yourself.
What if it was somebody who totally was opposed to it and then suddenly appears with it, and you hear through the grapevine that they were able to buy it? I mean, it looks good, but you heard that, you asked them, they deny it. I mean, I guess you have no.
It's a tough spot at that point.
Yeah.
If you have somebody who came to you and said, I was in a conversation with so-and-so and they bragged about purchasing this card on the internet. You can believe that person over the employee who submitted the card. It's like anything else. It's a bit of a he said, she said. You can believe one or you can believe the other.
Right.
But again, that's really a judgment call in light of the circumstances.
Right.
So yeah, but if you do have someone, suddenly who's come to their senses about getting the vaccine, and after they've been, vehement about not, I think it's something to question. What changed your mind, kind of thing. And and if you do find someone who has falsified that card, they really do have to be exited immediately. It's like anything else. If somebody lies to you or forges a document, why on earth would you want to keep them in your employ, if that makes sense?
Right. And I guess, one of the biggest problems is that, especially in the dental field right now, there's such a shortage of dentists and hygienists. And I think, dentists that are having employees who are unwilling to be vaccinated, and then also, and presenting, those exemptions, and then unwilling to be tested, they're kind of in a situation where it's going to hurt my business if I let them go.
Oh, sure.
But I could potentially be in violation of this executive order if I don't. So I guess one of the final things that really is to kind of clarify that we really don't know about how this is going to be enforced. We have no idea. Will they come in and impose fines? Will they somehow hold you legally responsible? Will they shut you down? Will they put it in a newspaper somewhere that you were not compliant? I mean, we have no idea.
We have no idea.
The truth is that most places are going to get away with it completely if they don't comply. That's absolutely. I mean, they can't police everybody, right? So we just don't. So the question is, how do you get in trouble? And I mean, I guess it could just be bad luck, right? I tend to find that people get in trouble when vaccinated employees or people complying with requirements, OSHA, otherwise, complain about the employer not enforcing requirements.
Yeah.
We saw that with previous mask mandates and availability and use of PPE and other guidance that came out. And if they felt the employer was not doing enough or whatever, they were the ones who made that phone call. So my guess is that if you're not requiring it and vaccinated people in your office are upset about it, that's where the complaint is going to come from. And that's really what I've been telling clients, is that I think you need to be aware of that. Now, could patients hear about it and complain about you too? Yeah, they could.
Oh, absolutely.
So, to me, those
again,
are
like you said, they can't police everyone. So I guess if I had to guess, I would say there's not going to be a lot of affirmative enforcement, inspections, that kind of thing. They simply don't have the manpower for that. It's going to come when we start getting multiple complaints from one particular doctor's office or hospital. And then I think they will feel an obligation to do something, whatever that something is. If it's coming in, if it's fining, per day, or shutting them down in the meantime, we'll have to see. But I sense that, again, from a budget and manpower perspective, I guess I don't see,
Right.
inspectors roaming the streets or anything like
Right.
that. I
But,
know when it came to masks and, the shutdown orders and that kind of thing, again, it was typically in response to complaints that
I
anything was done.
agree. I agree. And I've been telling clients, look, you've got that person in your office who's a nosy body and they're going to be the ones complaining. I said, do your best to comply. I said, but I also think that if somebody's not vaccinated and the reason is a medical issue or a religious exemption, that's their private business. They have to share it with you, but they don't have to explain to other people in your office
Sure.
what the exemption is. And so people should really just mind their own business. They don't need to be talking about their personal beliefs or their vaccination. I think that's really the only way to keep keep under the radar, so to speak.
No, I hear you, but people
of course,
can't resist. People can't resist, though.
Right. And I'm not telling people not to comply. I'm just saying, sometimes it's better not to talk too much about these things. So.
Oh, sure. And, you're right. These things are confidential anyway. So, you'd like to think that an employee would understand, well, simply because so-and-so is getting tested on a weekly basis doesn't necessarily mean anything, really. But I think human nature is such that when there's this kind of drama, people cannot stay out of it.
All right. Well, Karen, any final words? You think we've kind of exhausted this topic for now?
Well, I'm sure this won't be the last word on this. Again, I'm surprised we haven't seen much about the governor's order, but I think it's only a matter of time before we do. And maybe that'll give us some clarity. We can only hope.
Exactly. All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us at the HealthLaw Hotspot. Please feel free to reach out to myself or Karen. You can find out more about us and see our other podcasts at ralaw.com. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
The Roetzel HealthLaw Hotspot is made available by the firm and its attorneys for educational purposes and to provide general information, not to provide specific legal advice. Use of the Roetzel HealthLaw Hotspot does not create an attorney-client relationship between you and the firm or any of its attorneys. The Roetzel HealthLaw Hotspot should not be used as a substitute for competent legal advice, and you should contact an attorney in your state about any legal needs or questions you may have.